case you hadn't guessed it already, I'm something of a Batman fan. In fact, Batman was the first superhero I loved and was introduced to as a child, and it was through the 1989 film by Tim Burton that I was introduced to the character and his world. More than that though, it opened up the door to a brand new genre of superheroes. So needless to say, this 1989 film left quite the impression on me as a young person, and it stayed with me my entire life, being the foundation, I suppose, for all of my love of this genre. And so I was delighted when a few years ago NECA got the license to the Tim Burton Batman films, and they produced the 1/4 scale action figures which look absolutely tremendous. Sadly, I don't own any myself, but they do look absolutely marvellous. And I remember when I saw the Batman figure, I thought it's only got to be a matter of time before these are scaled down to the 7-inch line and I can finally get my hands on them. Sadly, that wasn't to be the case due to the fact that there are some licensing issues preventing this, but they did manage to release a 7-inch Batman based on the computer game. Now this was highly stylized with lots of different colours and really wasn't authentic to the kind of Batman that I wanted in my collection. So for a long time I thought my dreams of having a 7-inch scale Batman from NECA would remain just that, a dream. However, with this special anniversary release on Blu-ray, NECA were able to do a deal with Warner Brothers to be able to produce the 7-inch scale Batman to go alongside it. And it wasn't long until this figure started to show up on the secondary market. So today I thought it'd be fun to take a closer look at this 7-inch 1989 Batman figure from NECA. Looking at the packaging, then we can see that NECA adopted the plastic clamshell packaging. There's a paper insert inside. This is pretty consistent with their approach for all of the output at this time for the 7-inch scale, but I'm sure this is getting a lot of people's nostalgic juices flowing because clearly this packaging is a little bit retro in the sense that it's clearly trying to emulate the branding of the film, but also the Toy Biz toy line that came out to support and tie into this film. If we look at that, of course, we can see that gold background there, we can see the Batman font, and we can see the sort of dots as well. So clearly this is very reminiscent of the Toy Biz design, and it's very nostalgic, and it's a lot of fun, and I'm sure a lot of people would really appreciate that, as I did. So I think this is a really nice touch. I think overall there's not an awful lot to it. It's basically just a window display where we can see the figure and his various accessories on full display there, but this looks really good. I still think you can hang this on your wall and it will look very, very nice. Now I have to say I absolutely love the reverse of this sleeve. It is pretty much text-free. There's a very little amount of text at the very bottom. This is disguised as being part of the newspaper, which I think is fantastic. I love how they've done this. They've got like a comic book image in there, the Gotham Globe, a little bit of information about the character. I think that looks fantastic, but of course what really drives this is the image, the photography at the top of the packaging. This is really excellent. You can definitely display this. It's very atmospheric, it's very authentic to what we see in the film, definitely recreates that environment of Gotham City, and it's just very, very nicely done. Now, the figure itself I actually think is the 1/4 scale figure. The reason for that is because of course we can see that the cape there is leather, and there's also a lot more shine and sheen on the body armour, which we will see isn't the case with the actual 7-inch scale figure. And when we open the figure up, we can see, of course, there are a few discrepancies. I think the most obvious one is the cape, which clearly is a cloth cape here made of cotton, not the heavy leather cape that we see in the production photos or in that 1/4 scale figure. Now in terms of the likeness, it's kind of difficult to rate this sculpt because obviously it is mostly cowl, but I think they've done a pretty decent job of replicating Michael Keaton's Batman. I think it's still recognisable in that jawline, and I think they've caught that likeness pretty well there. In terms of the actual cape and cowl itself, I think it looks really good. I love how they've used a rubber material for the cowl, in particular that headpiece there, rubber ears and a rubber texture. It definitely gives it a sense of authenticity, makes it feel a bit more authentic and a bit more real, and it gives it a lot more texture, which is a lot of fun. But I do have a few nitpicks when it comes to the paint apps. We can see that they're just kind of slightly off when it comes to the eyes underneath the mask. You kind of got to be positioned just the right angle to make sure you can see the whites of his eyes, otherwise it looks slightly odd from certain angles. But also on the bat symbol there as well, it's just missing a bit of piece of the yellow behind the bat wing on the right hand side of this image. So overall pretty nice, but a little bit sloppy in some places. The body mould is pretty interesting, and I think it's pretty faithful to what we see on screen. I think they've done a nice job with the sculpt when it comes to the torso in particular, with the muscle set there, and the gauntlets are nicely sculpted as well. They do have the bat wings on the end, so I think they've done a pretty good job of this. Obviously, there's a couple of different materials that they've used. The main arms are a hard, solid plastic, whereas the torso piece and around the crotch area is actually made of a rubber, which again, pretty cool. Nice to have these different textures, pretty faithful to what we see in the costume on screen, which is pretty good. And yet somehow it does give the figure a little bit of a gawky element where it looks a little bit clunky, not quite in proportion, and a little bit strange in some places. But that said, overall it's pretty good. It's pretty faithful to what we see on screen. It does the job quite nicely. Now the belt itself is sculpted very nicely, and the paint apps aren't bad, but it would have been nice to have a little bit more variation here, a little bit more nuance to it, because it is just molded in that one sort of gold paint, and it would have been nice if there'd been a little bit of a wash or shading running through this. Now, despite my initial reservations about the cape, I have to say it's actually very, very nice. It's actually quite sizable, it's got the correct shape, which is fantastic, and it's quite malleable in the sense that you can do a lot of things with it. You can fold it up behind his shoulders or wrap it around him so he's fully cowled. So I think this actually works very nicely. Now, of course, my preference would be for the actual leather to, again, authenticity's sake for what we see on screen, but I think this is a fair compromise. This still works pretty nicely and does the job. As I said, the hands and the gauntlets are very nicely sculpted, and you can actually see there's an effort to do something slightly different with them in terms of the paint apps, because these are glossy paint, so they tend to shine a little bit more. Now, it's a little bit inconsistent, and it definitely seems to show up more in some areas than others, but there is a definite attempt to try and give this a little bit of a different texture on the gloves than on the arms. Now, the legs and the boots are a matte black. In fact, they are just in the plastic that they've been sculpted in, so there's no real paint apps here whatsoever, which is a shame. It would have been nice to have replicated that gloss on the boots at least. One thing I do like, though, are these ankle guards, which are a separate rubber piece. They hide the articulation in the foot, which is great, and again, gives it a little bit of extra texture and detail, which is always fun. So, looking at articulation, he does have a ball joint in the head, in the neck, so he can spin his head from side to side quite comfortably. Of course, that cowl will come with him, but again, that's authentic to what we see on screen, so that's not a problem. He can actually move his head up and down a little bit as well. Again, pretty consistent with what we would expect from the character on screen, so no issues with this whatsoever. The limitations work perfectly well with this figure. Now, he has ball joints in the shoulders. I've got to admit, mine are fairly stiff, and I couldn't get a huge range of motion out of this shoulder, to be honest, so it kind of comes forward a little bit, but not a huge amount. Now, he does have a pin swivel at the elbow, so he can rotate that lower arm all the way around. There's another swivel at the top of the gauntlet there, so that rotates 360 degrees, and there is a pin swivel at the wrist, so again, the hand rotates 360 degrees, and it hinges forwards and backwards a little bit, not a huge amount. Now, he does have a ball joint in the mid-chest area, so he can spin all the way around from side to side, lean left and right, and bend forwards and backwards, although I have to point out with mine, did have a tendency to want to fall apart and come loose. There are ball joints in the hips, the legs do kick out to the side, but they can also rotate around at the top of the hip there as well, which is pretty cool. The legs kick forwards and backwards, and there is another pin swivel at the knee there, so that lower leg can spin from side to side, but it can also bend to roughly 90 degrees as well. And then finally, there is an ankle pivot that allows that foot to hinge forwards and backwards and move from side to side. For accessories, he does come with a couple of those wonderful toys that we see in the film, including an extra pair of closed fists, a batarang, and his grapple gun. These are all very nicely sculpted and painted as well, so we can see lots of detail, especially when it comes to that grapple gun there, but we can see some lovely paint apps. We can see the gold on the end of the grapple gun, we can see silver dotted throughout the end of the handle there as well, and then even on the batarang we can see on the tips there's some silver paint, which is a really nice, lovely touch. I'll admit I was initially quite skeptical that he'd be able to hold his grapple gun when I saw the cut of his hand and the fact that there's nothing really to grip onto that much with the grapple gun. But that said, it actually fits perfectly. It fits quite snugly, and yeah, it hasn't really fallen out of his grip at all. So I have to say this actually works pretty well, and it looks fantastic, like very authentic to what we see on screen, and it just looks brilliant, especially when you pose him in positions like this. I think it looks really, really good. Sadly, I can't say the same for the Batarang. Definitely really struggled with this. In this closed fist, there is a gap, a little hole for you to be able to slide the Batarang in there, but it's very, very loose, and this does have a tendency to fall out constantly. So you're going to rely on gravity a little bit and a bit of luck, I think, when posing this guy. And it's a real shame because it's such a nice piece, but yeah, it doesn't work as well as it should. Final thoughts then, well, I've got mixed feelings when it comes to this figure. Of course, I was absolutely delighted to get my hands on this figure. It's a version of this character I've wanted for a long, long time in this scale, so absolutely I'm thrilled to have him in the collection. But there's a couple of disappointments with that I have to acknowledge. I would have much preferred he had the leather cape. That would have looked so much better. I think some of the proportions are slightly off. It looks a little clunky sometimes, and there's definitely some quality control issues when it comes to some of the joints, particularly in his midriff. That was quite loose on mine and has a tendency to come away. Likewise, one of his elbows was very, very stiff and was in danger of snapping off, which I was very conscious of. Definitely some quality control when it comes to holding his Batarang as well. It's kind of disappointing that it's not a nice, tight, snug grip. That said, of course, the grapple gun is perfect, so I've got no issues there. I think I'm a little bit disappointed by the paint apps as well. I think it would have been nice to have had a little bit more of a wash running through some of these areas, and obviously there's some clunky misfires, particularly on that central bat logo there, which is missing a bit of the yellow, which makes it just look a little bit lopsided. But other than that, I do think it's a really nice sculpt. I actually think it's quite impressive, and you put him in the right poses and utilise his cape correctly, you can actually have a really impressive figure here. So all in all, I actually think it's a pretty fun figure to have in the collection, and I think it's definitely a worthy addition to this line. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.